At Palace, Prince George wasn't usually one to raise his voice, not in public, not even at home. But that day, standing in the middle of Clarence House, surrounded by adults who wore polished smiles and drank tea like nothing was wrong, he couldn't stay quiet anymore. It wasn't about duty or titles, it was about his little brother. It all began weeks earlier, inside the playroom at Kensington Palace. Prince Louis, only 7 years old, had started changing. He wasn't cracking jokes or leaping into George's arms the way he usually did. The boy who used to laugh while making rocket ships out of couch cushions now sat quietly with his red toy fire truck, just rolling it back and forth like a machine stuck on repeat. Kate noticed it, of course, but with her calendar stacked with royal engagements and charity events, she chalked it up to fatigue. William was the same. He meant well, always did, but the royal schedule was relentless. Only George, observant in a way most adults failed to be, could see the cracks deepening in Louis' smile. He started paying attention, listening more, watching closely during family gatherings, especially the ones held at Clarence House. That's where it really started to click. The way Louis would tense up the moment they mentioned Camilla's home. The way his voice got shaky whenever Henry and Edward's names came up. George wasn't stupid. He might have been just 12, but he'd already figured out that the royal family ran on silence, appearances over truth, smiles over screams. But he also knew that some things weren't meant to be ignored. One day, they were sitting beside the pond at Kensington Gardens when George gently asked, "Why don't you like Clarence House anymore?" Louis hesitated, then shrugged, staring at a leaf floating on the water. "They play weird games," he said quietly. "Games I don't like." George didn't push. He just nodded and squeezed Louis' hand, knowing something was wrong but unsure just how bad it really was. The truth hit him like a punch during their next visit. While the adults mingled and Camilla held court in her perfectly staged drawing room, the kids were herded into a smaller play area. Henry and Edward, the Parker Bowles twins, wasted no time dragging Louis into a game they called Kingdom. Only it wasn't a game. Not really. It was an excuse to boss him around, to make him fetch water, clean up toys, and stand in corners like he was some servant. They mocked his baby teeth, his pronunciation, his funny voice. They called him names when no one else was watching, threatened him with Camilla's wrath if he didn't obey. George saw all of it, saw Louis' small hands shaking as he handed over a glass of water, heard the choked up silence when he was laughed at for stumbling over a word. That was it. George stood up, walked across the room, and put himself between Louis and the twins like a guard dog. "Stop it," he said firmly, his voice louder than it had ever been inside those royal walls. They laughed it off, of course, said they were just playing, but George wasn't buying it anymore. And when they got home, he didn't let it go. That night, with Louis curled up under his blanket and fighting back tears, George sat beside him and asked what else had happened. Louis told him everything. The mocking, the threats, the fear. And George listened. Not like a prince, not like an heir. Just like a big brother. And he made a promise right there, with the moonlight casting shadows across their bedroom floor. "I'll fix this," he said. "No one gets to make you feel small." The palace was quiet, but George's thoughts were anything but. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Louis, eyes wide with fear, voice shaking as he repeated what those twins had said. That wasn't something a little brother should carry alone, and if none of the adults were going to do anything about it, then maybe it was up to him. The next morning, George made up his mind. He walked into Camilla's private sitting room like he belonged there. She was sipping tea, surrounded by books and fresh flowers, looking like the picture of grandmotherly grace. George stood tall, even though his heart was pounding. "Granny Camilla," he said. She looked up, surprised. "George, darling, what brings you here?" "It's about Henry and Edward." Camilla blinked, still smiling, but George noticed the slight pause before she spoke. "What about them?" "They've been bullying Louis," he said. "He's scared to come here. They make him play games where he's their servant. They laugh at how he talks. He cries at night." For a moment, Camilla didn't respond. Then she set her cup down, leaned forward, and said in a voice that was soft but cool, "Oh, George, boys will be boys." Louis very sensitive, you know. I'm sure they were just playing. George felt like someone had knocked the wind out of him. It's not just playing, he insisted. He's scared. I'll speak to them, Camilla said, brushing invisible lint from her sleeve. But let's not make a fuss. These things blow over. He left her room furious. She hadn't listened. Not really. She just wanted the problem to go away without anyone seeing the mess. George had gone in, hoping for a grown-up to help, but walked out realizing something more important. He couldn't count on them. Not Camilla, not even the king. He knew what he had to do. The next family gathering came a few days later. Clarence house again. The same polished floors, the same buttery pastries and carefully poured tea. And again, Louis clung to George's side, eyes darting around the room every time Henry or Edward came near. The adults were all smiles, toasting some event no one under the age of 15 cared about. Everything looked perfect, which meant it was the perfect time to blow it all up. George stood up from the couch in the middle of the room. His voice was calm, but every word landed like thunder. I need to say something. The chatter stopped. Kay turned toward him with a curious smile. William raised an eyebrow. Camilla's teacup froze halfway to her lips. There's been bullying in this family, George said. Louise has been hurt, mocked, bossed around, scared into silence, and no one listened when we told the truth. Gasps, a dropped spoon. Silence, George continued, his voice unwavering. I told Granny Camilla. She said not to make a fuss, but I am making a fuss. Because if no one here cares about Louis being safe, I'll make sure the whole country hears about it. The room spun in stunned stillness. Henry and Edward turned red. Camilla stood up, visibly shaking. How dare you speak like that in front of everyone? I'm telling the truth, George replied. That's what future kings are supposed to do, right? Kate was already standing, tears in her eyes. William moved toward his son with quiet pride in every step. But it was Louis who said the words that mattered most. He looked up at George and whispered, "Thank you." In that moment, George wasn't just the heir to the throne, paper. The headlines hit faster than anyone could contain them. Prince George confronts Queen Camilla over bullying, screamed one paper. Future king takes a stand for little brother, read another. Social media lit up in support. Protect Louis trended within hours with posts praising George's courage and slamming the palace's silence. Behind the gates of Kensington Palace, the fallout was immediate. William read the reports in disbelief, pride battling with frustration. Liz sat beside him, scrolling through messages of support and concern from around the world. Her eyes shimmered with emotion. Our son did what we couldn't, she whispered. He protected his brother with the whole world watching. William stood, pacing. Camilla tried to cover it up. Charles is still pretending it's just kids being kids. This can't be ignored now, not anymore. A private meeting was called at Clarence house. The air inside the ancient study felt heavier than usual. William, composed but visibly furious, addressed the room. Charles sat at the head of the table, quiet and contemplative. Camilla looked pale, her lips pressed tight. My son was humiliated and hurt, William said, and when George tried to speak up, he was dismissed. Now the entire country knows. What are we going to do about it? Camilla broke her silence. I've already spoken to Henry and Edward. They understand the consequences. Not good enough, William snapped. They need to apologize to Louis in front of him, in front of us, and we need to make it right, not just behind closed doors. Charles nodded slowly. Let's do what needs to be done. A few days later, inside a quiet sitting room at Clarence house, the Parker Bowles twins stood awkwardly in front of Louis. Gone were the smirks and swagger. Their eyes stayed on the floor as Kate and William stood behind their youngest, each with a hand on his shoulder. George sat nearby, arms crossed, watching closely. Henry cleared his throat. We're sorry, Louis. Edward added, we shouldn't have made fun of you. We were wrong. Louis didn't say anything right away. He looked up at his mother, then over at George. Finally, with a small, almost fragile voice, he said, "Thank you for saying sorry." That moment changed everything. William and Kate decided to pull their family back for a while, away from the noise, away from the palace drama. They took George, Charlotte, and Louis to Anmer Hall, their countryside retreat surrounded by trees, fields, and peace. No cameras, no whispers, just space to heal. Louis began to smile again. slowly like a flower uncurling in the sun. He chased Charlotte through the gardens, kicked footballs with William, and started drawing silly pictures again like he used to. George was always nearby, never too far from his brother. They spent long afternoons on the porch swing, talking about nothing and everything. One night, under a starlit sky, George and Louis sat together watching the fireflies dance over the lawn. "Are you okay now?" George asked, nudging him gently. Louis nodded. "I'm not scared anymore." George smiled. "Good, because you're never alone. Not while I'm around." Inside, Kate watched them from the window, her hand resting in William's. "They're going to be okay," she whispered. William nodded, his voice low. "They're stronger than we ever were." The bond between George and Louis, forged in pain, strengthened by love, became something unshakable. In a family built on rules, protocol, and image, they had carved out something real. A promise made not with crowns or titles, but with heart. And one day, when George finally wore the crown, everyone would remember the boy who stood tall, not just for a throne, but for his little brother.